At 69, Helen Carter found herself doing something she had never imagined she would do. She was sitting at her own kitchen table in the house she had paid for, explaining to her 43-year-old daughter why she wanted to take a 5-day trip with 2 friends. She explained who was going. She explained where they would stay. She explained that the hotel had good reviews. She explained that they would not drive after dark. She explained that she had enough money. She explained that someone would collect her mail. She even explained which medications she planned to pack. And somewhere in the middle of all those explanations, Helen had a strange thought. Why am I defending this? She wasn't asking her daughter for money. She wasn't asking her daughter to take care of the house. She wasn't asking anyone to change their plans. She was simply going to Charleston with 2 friends. But the conversation didn't feel like an announcement. It felt like an application. And the more Helen explained, the more questions came. Was the hotel really in a safe area? What if one of them got sick? Who was driving? Why Charleston? Why now? Wouldn't she rather save that money? And why didn't she spend that week visiting the grandchildren instead? Helen loved her family. That was never the question. But what she was beginning to understand was something many people discover after 60, 70, or even later. Sometimes the people who love you most can slowly become accustomed to having a vote in decisions that were never theirs to make. And sometimes, without realizing it, we teach them to expect that vote by explaining ourselves over and over again. If you're over 60, there are some decisions you may want to discuss with your family. There are some decisions where advice is valuable. There may even be maybe moments when accepting help is the wisest thing you can do. But there is an important difference between listening to people who care about you and asking for permission to live your own life. Helen was about to learn that difference, and once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Her story is fictionalized, but it is inspired by situations many older adults experience as family roles begin to change. Helen had spent most of her life being the person other people came to for answers. For more than 30 years, she had worked in public education in North Carolina. She started as a 2nd-grade teacher and eventually became an elementary school principal. She had handled angry parents, frightened children, budgets, teachers, emergencies, school boards, and thousands of decisions that had to be made whether she felt ready or not. She raised 2 children. She helped care for her own mother during the final years of her life. She managed the household finances with her husband, Daniel. And when Daniel died 4 years earlier, after 42 years of marriage, Helen had somehow managed the hardest transition of her life. The first year after his death was mostly survival. There were mornings when she made coffee for 2 people before remembering there was only one person at the table. There were evenings when the silence inside the house felt almost physical. For a while, Helen welcomed every call from Laura and Michael. Laura called nearly every day. Michael checked in several times a week. At first, the attention felt comforting. It reminded Helen that she still belonged to something, but grief changes slowly. By the 3rd year, Helen was beginning to feel like herself again. She joined a local walking group. She started meeting her friend Susan for lunch every Thursday. She planted tomatoes again. She began going to concerts at a small theater downtown. And for the first time since Daniel died, Helen started imagining a future instead of simply remembering a past. That was when the questions began to feel different. Not cruel, not aggressive, just constant. Who are you going with? How late will you be home? Are you sure you should be driving that far? How much did that cost? Why do you need that? Did you talk to Michael before you decided? Why didn't you tell me? Each question seemed reasonable when taken alone. Together, they created something Helen couldn't quite name. At first, she answered everything, partly because she had nothing to hide, but mostly because she did not want her children to worry. If Laura sounded anxious, Helen gave more details. If Michael questioned something, Helen explained her reasoning. She believed that if she could simply make them understand, they would relax. But that isn't what happened. Every explanation opened the door to another question, and every question made Helen feel as though her decision remained unfinished until everyone else was satisfied with it. The trip to Charleston was the first time she clearly noticed it. Susan had suggested the trip during lunch. Another friend, Carol, wanted to go too. 5 days, a comfortable hotel, good restaurants, a little shopping, no complicated itinerary. Helen had smiled before Susan had even finished describing it. I'd love to. That should have been the entire decision. Helen had the time. She had the money. She was healthy enough to travel. She wanted to go. But when she told Laura that evening, Helen automatically began explaining. She hadn't planned to. The words simply came out. We found a nice hotel, and don't worry. Carol knows the area, and Susan's daughter has stayed there before, and we're taking Carol's SUV because it's newer. Laura interrupted. Mom, who's going to drive? Carol. The whole way? We'll probably share. Do you really think you should be driving that long? Helen felt herself becoming defensive. I drive perfectly well. I didn't say you don't. Then why are you asking? I'm just concerned. That sentence had become familiar. I'm just concerned. Helen knew concern was not the enemy. She appreciated having children who cared whether she arrived home safely, but concern had begun functioning like a master key. It seemed capable of opening every locked door in her private life. A few minutes later, Michael called. Laura had mentioned the trip to him. Helen immediately realized what had happened. A family discussion had begun about a decision Helen had already made. Michael was calm. He usually was. You know, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. Mom, Helen almost laughed. That sentence was usually followed by someone telling her what to do. I know. I just think 5 days is a lot. Why? I don't know. It's just a lot of driving, money, unfamiliar places. Maybe start with a weekend somewhere closer. Start with a weekend. Helen stared at the wall across from her kitchen table. She was 69 years old. She had traveled internationally with Daniel. She had supervised a school containing nearly 600 children. She had navigated airports, hospitals, funerals, mortgages, and decades of adult life. And her son had just suggested that she practice traveling with a weekend somewhere close to home. Again, Michael wasn't being cruel. That almost made the realization more important. He truly thought he was helping. The problem was that somewhere along the way, Michael and Laura had stopped seeing their mother's independence as the default. Now independence was something Helen had to demonstrate, something she had to prove, something they would approve as long as they were comfortable with it. Helen ended the call without arguing, but that night she kept thinking about it. The next morning, she told Susan what happened. Susan was 70, divorced, sharp-witted, and rarely afraid to say something uncomfortable. Helen finished telling the story and said, "I just don't know how to make them understand that I'm fine." Susan took a sip of coffee. "Maybe stop trying." Helen looked at her. "What?" "Stop trying to convince them." "But they're worried." "Let them be worried." Helen frowned. Susan continued, "There's a difference between telling your family what you're doing and presenting a case for why you're allowed to do it." Helen didn't answer. Susan leaned forward slightly. "You keep giving them reasons, and every reason becomes something they can debate." That sentence followed Helen home. Every reason becomes something they can debate. Over the following weeks, Helen started noticing how often it happened. It happened with money. One afternoon, she bought a new dining table. The old one had belonged to her and Daniel for almost 30 years. It was heavy, scratched, and far too large for how Helen used the room now. She found a smaller table made from oak and loved it immediately. She could afford it easily. But when Michael noticed it during a visit, Helen felt the explanation starting before he even asked. The old table was getting worn out, and this one was on sale, and I got free delivery. Michael looked at the table. "How much was it?" Helen told him. He raised his eyebrows. "That's a lot for a table." And suddenly, Helen was explaining her finances. She told him she had enough savings. She reminded him that the house was paid off. She explained that she had compared prices. She said she hadn't made a large purchase in months. Later that evening, she felt embarrassed. Not because she had bought the table, because she had acted as if she needed to justify buying it. This is the first decision many people after 60 need to reconsider explaining constantly to their families. How you spend your own money. There is an important qualification here. Financial decisions matter. If you are considering a major investment, transferring property, changing your estate plan, giving someone access to your accounts, or making a decision you do not fully understand, qualified financial or legal advice may be wise. And if your spending threatens your ability to pay for housing, health care, food, or other essential needs, then a trusted conversation may be helpful. But that is very different from believing your adult children deserve an explanation for every dinner, trip, gift, piece of furniture, or hobby you choose to enjoy. Money you spent decades earning does not automatically become family property because you have reached a certain birthday. Helen had always been financially careful, yet she noticed herself saying things like, "Don't worry, it wasn't expensive," or "I know I didn't need it, but," or "I had a coupon." Why? She would never have spoken that way at 49. When had buying something for herself become something requiring a defense? The second area was even more important, where she chose to live. Helen loved her house. It was a 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood outside Asheville. Daniel had done much of the woodworking himself. The backyard had a maple tree they planted shortly after moving in. Helen knew every neighbor on the street. Her doctor was 15 minutes away. Her church was nearby. The grocery store was familiar. Her friends were close. But Laura and Michael had begun mentioning the house more frequently. At first it was casual. "That's a lot of yard." "These stairs worry me." "Wouldn't you like something smaller?" Then Michael began sending links to condominiums. Laura mentioned a senior community near her house. Nothing urgent, nothing openly forceful. But the assumption underneath the conversations was beginning to bother Helen. Her house was being discussed as a temporary arrangement, a problem waiting to be solved. One Sunday, Michael brought it up during lunch. "You know, Mom, If you sold while the market is strong, you could probably get a really good price. Helen said, I'm not planning to sell. Michael nodded. I know, not right now. No, I'm not planning to sell. I understand. I'm just saying it might make sense in the next couple of years. And there it was again. Helen began explaining. She said the gardener handled the difficult yard work. She said she could still manage the stairs. She said she had installed better lighting. She explained that the roof had recently been replaced. She talked about the neighbors. She discussed maintenance. Then Laura joined in. What happens if you fall? Michael asked whether she had considered the cost of keeping such a large property. Laura suggested a one-floor townhouse. Within 10 minutes, Helen found herself debating whether she deserved to remain in the home she owned. That evening, she thought about Susan's words again. Every reason becomes something they can debate. If Helen said the stairs were manageable, Laura could argue that they might not be manageable next year. If Helen said the house was paid off, Michael could argue that maintenance still cost money. If Helen said she loved the neighborhood, someone could suggest another neighborhood. There would always be another argument, and Helen realized something. She didn't need the perfect argument. She needed a boundary. The next time Michael mentioned selling, she tried something different. I know you're thinking about my future, Helen said. If I decide I want help considering other places to live, I'll ask you. Michael hesitated. I'm just trying to be practical. I know. You don't want to at least look? No. And Helen stopped talking. The silence felt almost rude. Not because she had been rude, because she had spent years filling silence with explanations. That is the second decision you may not need to keep defending after 60. Where you choose to live. Again, safety matters. Reality matters. There may come a time when stairs become difficult, maintenance becomes overwhelming, or living alone no longer feels safe. Preparing for those possibilities is responsible, but planning for the future does not require surrendering the present. If you are capable of making your own decisions, your home is not automatically a family committee decision. You can listen, you can prepare, you can make modifications, you can create a backup plan, and you can still say, for now, this is where I choose to live. The third decision Helen learned to stop explaining was who she spent time with. That lesson came through David Monroe. David was 71 and had lost his wife 6 years earlier. He met Helen through the walking group. At first, they simply talked. Then they started having coffee after the walks. Eventually, David asked Helen if she wanted to attend a jazz performance with him. She said yes. Helen wasn't even sure what she wanted the relationship to become. She liked him. He was kind. He made her laugh. He didn't try to replace Daniel, and Helen didn't want him to. She simply enjoyed his company. But when Laura learned about David, the questions began immediately. Who is he? How long have you known him? Where does he live? Was he married? Do you know his children? What does he do with his money? Helen laughed at first. Laura, I'm having dinner with him. I'm not marrying him. I know. I just want you to be careful. There was that phrase again. Just be careful. And yes, older adults should be careful. Romance scams and financial exploitation are real. New relationships deserve the same judgment and caution at 70 that they deserved at 30. Perhaps even more if large assets, property, or inheritance are involved. But caution doesn't mean adult children are entitled to every private detail of your relationships. Helen noticed something else. When Laura had started dating her husband years earlier, Helen had asked questions, but she had eventually accepted that Laura was an adult. Now the roles were changing in a way that felt uncomfortable. Laura wanted access to information that Helen did not necessarily want to share. One evening, after dinner with David, Laura called, "Oh, how was your date?" "It was nice." "Where did you go?" "A restaurant downtown." "Which one?" Helen almost answered automatically. Then she stopped. "It was nice, Laura." A pause. "Okay, are you not telling me?" "I'm telling you what I want to tell you." Laura sounded hurt. Helen felt guilt rise immediately. That guilt had controlled more decisions than Helen wanted to admit. So she added gently, "I'm happy. I'm being careful. And if there's something important I think you should know, I'll tell you." Laura didn't love the answer, but Helen didn't change it. Privacy is not secrecy. That distinction matters. You can love your family and still keep parts of your life for yourself. You can have friendships your children do not fully understand. You can date. You can choose companionship. You can decide what you share and what remains yours. Getting older does not cancel your right to privacy. The fourth decision appeared in a place Helen least expected. Her grandchildren. Helen adored them. Laura had 2 children, ages 9 and 12. For years, Helen had happily helped with school pickups, weekend visits, summer afternoons, and the occasional emergency. After Daniel died, time with the grandchildren had even helped fill some of the emptiness. But slowly, something changed. What had once been a gift began to feel like an expectation. Laura would call and say, "I need you to get the kids Thursday." Not, "Are you available?" Not, "Would you mind?" Just, "I need you." Most of the time, Helen said yes. And when she couldn't, she explained, "I have lunch with Susan." "I have an appointment." "I'm going to the walking group." Sometimes Laura would respond, "Can you move it?" And Helen often did. The problem wasn't the grandchildren. The problem was that Helen had begun treating her own plans as less important simply because they involved pleasure instead of responsibility. If she had a doctor's appointment, saying no felt acceptable. If she simply wanted to meet David for coffee, suddenly she felt selfish. One Friday, Laura asked Helen to watch the children the following Saturday. Helen already had tickets to a garden tour with Susan. Her first instinct was to explain the entire situation. "We bought the tickets 3 weeks ago, and Susan has really been looking forward to it, and I already promised." Then Helen stopped. "I'm not available Saturday." Laura sounded surprised. "What are you doing?" "I already have plans." "Can you change them?" "No." Another pause. "Mom, it's just that we really need someone." Helen felt the familiar guilt. She wanted to rescue Laura from inconvenience, but she also remembered how many times her own plans had been treated as optional. "I'm sorry you're in a difficult spot," she said, "but I won't be available." Helen did not tell Laura about the garden tour, not because it was a secret, because the reason didn't matter. That was difficult for Helen to accept. She had spent so much of motherhood explaining the reasons behind her decisions that she had forgotten adults are sometimes allowed to say no simply because they do not want to say yes. After 60, you do not need to justify every boundary with your adult children or grandchildren. You can love your grandchildren deeply without becoming the default babysitter. You can help frequently without becoming permanently available. You can say yes because you want to, and you can say no without manufacturing an emergency to make the answer acceptable. A boundary doesn't become more legitimate because you attach a dramatic excuse to it. Sometimes "I already have plans" is enough. Sometimes even "that doesn't work for me" is enough. And sometimes the plan you're protecting is simply a quiet afternoon in your own home. Rest is a plan. The fifth decision is closely related: how you spend your time. Many people reach retirement believing they will finally own their schedule. Then something surprising happens. Other people begin claiming it. Adult children need help. Grandchildren have activities. Relatives assume you're available because you no longer have a job. Friends expect favors. Organizations ask for volunteers. And before long, retirement can become a calendar filled with everyone else's priorities. Helen experienced this slowly. She was retired. So, in Laura's mind, Helen was usually free. But Helen no longer wanted to describe her days as free. Her days belonged to her. That did not mean every hour needed to be productive. Some mornings Helen read until 10. Sometimes she spent 2 hours in the garden. Sometimes she watched an old movie in the middle of the afternoon. Sometimes she went walking with friends. Sometimes she did nothing worth explaining, and she began to understand that doing nothing was not evidence that someone else deserved her time. You do not have to prove that your schedule is full before you are allowed to protect it. Your time has value because it is yours. The sixth decision became more complicated because it involved money and family loyalty. Michael had always been responsible, but when his business went through a difficult year, he asked Helen for help. The amount was not enormous. Helen could afford it, so she gave him the money. 6 months later, he asked again. This time, Helen hesitated. She had been reviewing her retirement expenses and thinking more seriously about what future health care might cost. She wanted to keep a larger emergency fund. When Michael called, she said she wasn't comfortable giving him more money. He didn't become angry, but he was disappointed. "I thought you said you were doing fine." "I am." "So is there something I don't know about?" "No." "Then why can't you help?" Helen felt the old reflex. "Explain." "Show numbers. Prove that the decision made sense." She almost told him exactly how much she had in savings. She almost explained her monthly expenses. She almost described the emergency fund she wanted to build. Then she remembered something important. Her financial boundary did not require Michael to agree with it. "I've decided not to lend any more money right now." Michael was quiet. "Can I ask why?" "You can ask." Helen smiled slightly, even though he couldn't see her. "But the answer is still no." It was one of the hardest sentences she had ever said to her son. Michael was disappointed. For a few days, Helen felt terrible. Then something surprising happened. Nothing collapsed. Michael figured out another solution. Their relationship survived. The grandchildren still loved her. Christmas still happened. Life continued. Helen had spent years imagining that disappointing someone she loved would damage the relationship. Instead, she learned that healthy relationships can survive disappointment. And if a relationship only feels peaceful when you always say yes, that peace may be costing you more than you realize. After 60, You should think carefully before placing your own retirement security at risk to rescue adult children financially. Helping family can be generous and meaningful, but generosity should not require sacrificing the stability you may need later. You have fewer working years available to rebuild major losses. If you are considering a large loan, gift, transfer of property, or change to your estate plan, speaking with a qualified financial or legal professional can help you understand the consequences. Love is important. So is arithmetic. The seventh decision was the deepest one of all. Which parts of your life belong only to you? Helen had become used to reporting herself, where she was going, who she was with, when she would return, what she bought, what the doctor said, what she planned to do next year. Laura even wanted Helen to share her phone location permanently. For emergencies, Laura said. Helen considered it. She understood the logic, and there might be circumstances where location sharing would make sense. During a long drive, on a hiking trip, if Helen developed a medical problem that increased the risk of becoming disoriented. But Helen did not want her adult children to be able to see where she was every hour of every day. She declined. Laura was surprised. Why? That one word, why? Helen felt the invitation to explain. Instead, she said, "Because I don't want to." Laura laughed nervously. "That's your reason?" "Yes." It felt almost rebellious. Yet it was one of the simplest truths Helen had spoken. Not wanting something is sometimes a reason. Wanting something is sometimes a reason. Preference is part of adulthood. You don't always need evidence. You don't always need a crisis. You don't always need an argument strong enough to win a debate. Sometimes the person who needs to accept your decision is you. Helen's real breaking point came a few weeks later. It was Sunday lunch at Laura's house. Michael was there with his wife. The grandchildren had gone upstairs. Conversation moved from ordinary topics to Helen's house again. Michael mentioned maintenance. Laura mentioned the stairs. Helen tried to change the subject. Then Laura reached for her phone. "We actually found a few places you might like." Helen looked at her. "Places?" "Communities closer to us." Laura began scrolling. There were photos of apartments, small patios, clubhouses, walking paths. Michael leaned over. "This one is only about 15 minutes from me." Helen stared at both of them. "How long have you two been looking at these?" Michael answered carefully. "We've talked about it a few times." "Without me?" "We're not doing anything, Mom." Laura quickly added, "We're just trying to plan ahead." There was no secret contract, no attempt to steal her house, no cruel scheme, just two adult children who genuinely believed they were being responsible. That was what made the moment so important. Helen looked at the phone, then at Michael, then Laura. And for the first time, she saw the path clearly. It wasn't that they had suddenly taken control. Control rarely arrives suddenly. It can grow through hundreds of tiny permissions, hundreds of explanations, hundreds of moments when someone else learns that your decision remains open until they are satisfied with it. Helen put her fork down. When did planning my future become something you two do without me? Laura's expression changed. "Mom, that's not fair. I'm asking. We're worried about you." "I know." Michael said, "We're trying to prevent a crisis." Helen nodded. "And I appreciate that." The room became quiet. Then Helen said something she had been learning for months. "You can be concerned about me without being in charge of me." Nobody answered. Helen continued, "If I need help, I want to know you're there. If you see something I'm missing, tell me. If you're worried, talk to me." She looked at Laura. "But don't mistake my willingness to listen for a request for permission." Laura looked hurt. Michael looked defensive. Helen expected herself to panic and start softening everything. She almost did. Then she stopped. She had already said what she meant. Nothing more was required. The conversation that followed was not perfect. Laura reminded Helen about a fall she had taken 2 years earlier. Michael talked about their grandmother, who had waited too long to move. Helen listened. Some of their fears were reasonable. That mattered. Boundaries do not mean automatically rejecting everyone else's concerns. Independence does not mean pretending you will never need help. Sometimes your family will notice something important before you do. Sometimes they will be right. But being right about one concern does not give someone permanent authority over every future decision. Helen eventually agreed to something. She would have a handrail added to the second staircase. She would review her emergency contacts. She would create a folder containing important documents and tell Laura where it was. But she would not sell the house. Not now. And her children would stop sending her listings unless she asked. That was the compromise. Not surrender. Not rebellion. A mature boundary. Over the next few months, something changed, not immediately. Laura still asked questions. Michael still offered opinions. Helen still sometimes felt guilty. But Helen changed the way she answered. When Laura asked about the Charleston trip again, Helen didn't repeat the hotel details. "The trip is booked. I'm looking forward to it." When Michael questioned the dining table, Helen smiled. "I like it." When Laura asked why she couldn't babysit, Helen said, "I'm not available." When Michael asked whether she had reconsidered the house, Helen said, "No." When someone wanted more explanation, Helen learned to tolerate the silence that followed. That may be one of the hardest skills to learn, because over-explaining often isn't really about information. It's about discomfort. We explain because we want the other person to stop being upset. We explain because we want them to agree. We explain because we want to prove we are reasonable. We explain because we fear being called selfish. We explain because after decades of being a parent, spouse, caregiver, or provider, disappointing family can feel like failure. But sometimes the more you explain, the weaker your boundary becomes. Think about the difference between these two sentences. "I'm sorry I can't come because I've had a long week and I haven't slept well. And I promised myself I would rest. And maybe I can come Sunday instead. And I won't be able to come Saturday." The first sentence offers several points for negotiation. You can rest here. You can sleep later. You don't have to stay long. Come for just an hour. The second sentence communicates a decision. That does not mean you should become cold. It does not mean you should stop sharing your life. Warmth and boundaries can exist together. You can say, "Oh, I appreciate you worrying about me," and still say, "I've made my decision." You can say, "I understand why you see it differently," and still say, "This is what works for me." You can say, "Thank you for the advice," without adding, I'll do what you suggested. This is especially important after 60 because families often begin preparing for a future that hasn't happened yet. Children may imagine you becoming frail. They may worry about driving. They may worry about falls. They may worry about money. They may worry about loneliness. And because they love you, they may start trying to prevent every possible future problem. But there is a danger in living today according to everything that might happen tomorrow. Yes, prepare. Yes, install the handrail. Yes, review your finances. Yes, make legal documents. Yes, think about transportation. Yes, have emergency contacts. Yes, build a support system, but preparation should protect your independence, not erase it early. There is another important point. Not everyone watching this will be in Helen's position. Some people do have medical conditions that affect judgment. Some families face dementia, serious mobility problems, addiction, financial exploitation, or other situations where greater involvement may become necessary. Those situations require care, honesty, and often professional guidance. This video is not about refusing reasonable help. It is about adults who are still capable of making their own decisions, recognizing when concern has quietly become control, and recognizing when their own habit of over-explaining is helping that happen. Helen did go to Charleston. The morning they left, Laura called, "Text me when you get there." Helen smiled. "Okay." That request felt reasonable. Helen wasn't trying to prove she didn't need anyone. She was trying to remember that needing people and belonging to people are not the same thing. She could text Laura when she arrived. She could share a picture of the hotel. She could call the grandchildren. And she could still make the trip because she wanted to. Halfway through the drive, Susan looked over from the passenger seat. "So, did you get permission?" Helen laughed. "No." Susan smiled. "Good." They reached Charleston in the afternoon. The weather was warm. They checked into the hotel, rested for a while, then went out for dinner. Nothing dramatic happened. No great confrontation, no crisis, no sudden transformation, and that was almost the point. For years, Helen had begun treating ordinary choices as though they carried enormous consequences. What if Laura was upset? What if Michael disagreed? What if someone thought she was irresponsible? That evening, Helen walked slowly nearer the waterfront with Susan and Carol. There were couples passing them, families, tourists, older people, young people, people laughing on restaurant patios. Helen stopped for a moment and looked at the water. She thought about the strange journey that had brought her there, not the drive from Asheville, the other journey, from asking herself, "Will my family approve?" to asking herself, "Is this right for me?" Those questions can produce very different lives. One gives everyone else a seat at the center of your decisions. The other reminds you that your life still belongs to you. After 60, there may be more conversations with your family about the future. Have them. There may be difficult decisions about health, housing, money, and support. Make them thoughtfully. Listen to people who have earned your trust. Ask for professional guidance when the issue requires it. But remember this: your children becoming adults does not make you a child. Age does not automatically transfer ownership of your decisions to someone else. You can change your mind. You can say no. You can spend an afternoon alone. You can travel. You can date. You can keep your home. You can move. You can help your children. You can stop helping your children. You can protect your money. You can protect your time. You can keep some things private. You can accept help without handing over the steering wheel. And perhaps most importantly, you can stop believing that every choice needs a closing argument. Sometimes a decision can simply be a decision. If someone you love disagrees, listen. If they make a good point, consider it. If you discover you were wrong, change course. There is strength in that too. But don't confuse disagreement with disobedience. You are not disobeying your adult children by choosing differently. You are living your life. And if your family has become accustomed to explanations, changing that pattern may feel uncomfortable at first. They may ask more questions. They may say, "You've changed." They may accuse you of being stubborn. You may even feel guilty. That discomfort doesn't always mean the boundary is wrong. Sometimes it simply means the relationship is learning a new shape. Helen's relationship with Laura and Michael didn't become worse. In some ways, it became more honest. Her children gradually realized something too. Their mother's independence wasn't a problem they needed to solve. It was something worth protecting. And Helen learned that she could hear their concerns without automatically surrendering to them. She could love them without constantly reassuring them. She could remain close without reporting every detail of her life. She could be their mother without living as though she needed their approval. That may be one of the quietest forms of freedom after 60. Not freedom from family, freedom inside the family, the freedom to say thank you for caring, and then make your own decision. So think about your own life for a moment. Is there something you keep explaining to your family? Where you live? How you spend your money? Who you spend time with? Why you don't want to babysit every weekend? Why you want to travel? Why you prefer living alone? Why you don't want to lend more money? Why you don't want to share every detail of your personal life? Ask yourself one question. Am I explaining this because communication is helpful, or because I feel I need permission? The answer may tell you more than you expect, and I'd really like to hear from you. What is one decision you no longer believe you should have to explain to your family? Tell us in the comments, and if you'd like, share your age and where you're watching from. Your experience may be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this video spoke to you, share it with someone who may need the reminder, and subscribe to Better with Time for more stories and practical conversations about protecting your peace, your money, and your independence after 60. Because getting older should not mean becoming smaller. It should mean knowing more clearly what deserves your explanation and what doesn't.